tracking the state's revenue situation rather closely. Yeah. And when it comes to this local control funding formula, how many have been tracking developments of what's happening in Sacramento closely? Okay. Well, I'm going to speed through quite a bit of material. So I was asked to bring us up to speed on the state budget, and then bring us up to speed on the local control funding formula, describe the governor's proposal, go through the strengths of it, what we see as the weaknesses of it, and then set the stage for the conversation that will follow. So to start with the state budget outlook, this slide comes from our November 2011 fiscal forecast. So it reflected what we thought the forecast was as of about a year and a half ago. And as you can see, it wasn't a particularly encouraging picture. So over the forecast period, we were projecting shortfalls each year, and they were in the magnitude of $5 to $10 billion. So on the upside, the shortfalls were less than they had been several years before when they were in the $20 billion range. But we were still, again, forecasting these shortfalls every year. So just looking a year and a half later, the situation is much improved. So this is a slide from our November 2012 forecast, and it shows that we're forecasting surpluses almost every year of the forecast, starting in 14-15, and surpluses that are notable, that grow from $1 billion to about $9 billion at the end of the period. So what happened? How in a year and a half can things have improved so much? So many of you know what's happened, so I'll just briefly mention them, but Prop 30 passed, which raised the sales tax rate for 4 years, raised personal income tax rates on wealthy folks for 7 years. Prop 39 passed, which increased corporate tax revenues. The national and state economies are improving, so the recovery is well underway. When you look at most indicators of unemployment and housing, unemployment is going down. Many indicators of the construction and housing market have been improving. The state also had made a number of actions over the preceding 5 years to sort of do some budgetary restraint, cut spending in education, social services, health, courts, across really all areas of the state budget, state compensation. So several factors contribute then. And the last one is on the federal level. The federal government has taken a number of actions that have sort of gotten the federal fiscal house in better order, with increasing payroll taxes, increasing taxes on the wealthy, reducing spending through the sequestration cuts. So one of the big concerns at the federal level was how sequestration, these 5% cuts to federal programs, would affect the general economy, both nationally and at the state level. And because the economy is sort of rebounding a little bit better than folks had projected, the downturn related to sequestration is likely to not be quite as significant as I think folks were predicting just 6 months ago. So a much better outlook. So many of you have also been reading newspapers, we even have an April revenue tracker every day. How much is the Franchise Tax Board collecting and reporting? And revenue, the situation as of today, is much better than even the governor had estimated back in January. So even over 4 months, the situation, when it comes to just the state's revenue situation, is much improved. In January, revenues were running $5 billion up, and there was lots of speculation things would happen between then and April so that we wouldn't be in as good shape when it came to April. But we are. As of the end of April, we're still $4.5 billion up. Corporate taxes are up a smidge and sales taxes are down just a smidge, but the real mover has been personal income taxes coming in well in advance, ahead of projections. So then we'll talk here about what this means for education. So this is doing a forecast just of the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee that provides funding for schools and community colleges. And it's showing that over this period, we had the minimum guarantee projected to increase from about $54 billion in 12-13 to $67 billion that last year of the forecast. It was a cumulative increase of about 24%, at the same time that we were projecting enrollment attendance to be generally flat. So every year we would be seeing increases 3 to 5.5%. Now things have improved even in 12-13, so this has already shifted just a little bit. But again, the sign for school funding is much improved today. So given that we know revenues are up $4.5 billion, we have a group of folks in Sacramento, both in our office and the Department of Finance, that are trying to make sense of what that means for the state fiscal year and for the year to come. And there's lots of speculation about all of the underlying factors and how much of it will really represent improvement in the economy and how much of it is just one time. There's theories that there were wealthy folks who decided to count some of their income, capital gains, dividends in 2012 because they didn't want the higher tax rate for 2013. So that maybe some of this is just accelerated income. That's coming at the expense of 13, 14. And some of it is real improvement in the economy. So folks are trying to work all that out. This is just an example, sort of ballpark of what we might be seeing in the coming months. Given we know revenues are up $4.5 billion, and we know that for state budget purposes, some of it's going to be scored back to last year on the thinking that some of it was really earned by folks in the first half of 2012. So $4 billion would be counted to the current year that we're in. This is the school year that's almost over. So now the state is making some decisions. How much has the guarantee gone up? And how do we provide that funding to schools in a reasonable way given the timing in the fiscal year? And then what will it mean for the 13-14 school year? And for this scenario, we just assume that state revenues are up about $1 billion next year. So a lot of it is acceleration, some of it's improvement in the economy. We'll still see a better scenario next year than the governor had predicted in January. So just focusing on 12-13 for a minute, that $4 billion in extra revenue would produce an increase in the Prop 98 minimum guarantee for schools of $3.7 billion. More than 90% of that increase would go to schools. When it comes to what we're seeing in 13-14 of that extra $1 billion, which is again just a ballpark assumption, the guarantee would go up by about $600 million. So now the conversation has turned to revenues are better, the guarantee is likely to be up, the state has to make some decisions about how to give this additional funding to schools. What does it do? There's two basic things it can do. It can start paying down some of its obligations and/or build up program support. When it comes to paying down obligations, the state has about $13 billion in outstanding obligations. Once you take into account all the late payments the state's making to schools, unpaid mandate claims, districts have done things but not got paid for them yet in that case as well, and court settlements. So about $13 billion of these one-time payments, things the state has to pay at some point in time. And then it can increase the base program. It can do this by giving every district the same % increase on a per pupil basis, the same dollar amount increase. It could provide COLA. It could provide COLA and then equalize funding rates. It could create new categorical programs. It has a wealth of options about how it builds up the base program. So the governor has one idea for how to build up the base. He's taking about half of the money and using it to retire these one-time obligations, at least start paying them down, and then the other half, roughly, to build up the base. And when it comes to building up the base, his idea is to do it via this new formula that you've all heard about, the local control funding formula. So just because the next hour or some of the conversation will focus on this formula, I wanted to start with what's it responding to? Because there's all these problems right now. What are those problems? Just quickly go over the nuts and bolts of the new funding structure, and then go quickly over the strengths and weaknesses. So over a couple of decades now, a number of research groups, there's broad consensus that California's existing school funding system, how the state gets money out to school districts, is broken. It's in need of a major overhaul. And virtually all of these groups have found the same things. So they argue that it's overly complex. The state right now has something called revenue limits, general purpose money that it gives out to schools on a per pupil basis. And it has something like 60 categorical programs as of 2008-09, state programs, and then a number of federal programs. Lots of programs, lots of formulas, and because of that, taken together, if somebody wanted the nuts and bolts, it took 2 hours to explain it, and then even then you only did justice to about 10 of the formulas. Hard to describe, explain, and understand. Also, some of these formulas that were associated with the 60 categorical programs were based on things that were happening in the 70s and 80s, things that are 30 or 40 years out of date. districts, and I'll just take an example of some districts in our vicinity here. When you look at Fremont Unified and San Jose Unified, two roughly equally sized districts, same area of the state, their revenue limit, their general purpose per pupil funding, almost identical. San Jose gets about $1,400 more out of the state system than Fremont, all associated with these categorical funds, much of which is associated with things that were happening 30 or 40 years ago. Because there are so many programs with so many spending requirements at the district level, they're having to fill out paperwork and do some compliance-oriented things. It's hard to, in some cases, put together a coherent program when you're isolated and how to best meet the needs of 60 different categorical programs. And then in these 60 categorical programs, they were state programs, state requirements. You only got the funding if you did what the state wanted to do. And because they were often one size fits all, we want you to do math, or art, or science, or professional development, or buy a book, or do PE. You had to do that, despite what your local conditions, local priorities might have indicated. So the state, again, knew that it had a problem. And when the recession hit, it decided to take one step toward fixing the problem by freeing up some of the money associated with some of those 60 categorical programs. It took 40 of them and said, you don't have to do the things you used to have to do with those 40. You'll still get the money, not quite so much, but most of it, and you can do what you need to do to get through the recession. Come 12-13, we're gonna resurrect the 40 programs. Well, 12-13 came around, no one wanted to resurrect the 40 programs, and so they said, well, okay, you can have flexibility for 2 more years, and then the programs will come back. So the governor is looking ahead to 14-15, talking to districts and teachers and parents and everyone, and not many people want those all 40 of those programs to come back. So what to do instead? He said, I essentially would like to throw out what we have today, the revenue limit, the 60 formulas. I don't want to resurrect them. I want to create something that folks can understand. That's simpler, that would be more rational. So his idea was to replace what we've got with what would be a base rate per pupil that would be standardized across the state once this was fully implemented 7 years from now. And those base rates would vary by grade span. So even if you can't see this very well, the grade spans would be K3, 4-6, 7-8, and 9-12. And they would vary. So at K3, you'd get about 6,400. It'd go up to about 7,700 for high schools. Then districts would get some additional money for every English learner and low-income student that they served, and it would be 35% of that base rate. And then districts who had high concentrations of EL and LI students would get another 35% for each of the EL and LI students above 50%. So there's an illustration. But before we move to the illustration, this is the nuts and bolts of it. I don't have on the slide 4 other things that the governor did, which we're going to describe as a weakness here in a moment, but they're sort of add-ons to this relatively elegant structure. So in addition to this, he takes 2 categorical programs with very outdated funding formulas, home to school transportation and the targeted instructional improvement block grant, largely associated with DSEG efforts. And just says, districts, you're gonna get what you get into perpetuity. We're just gonna lock those in as add-ons. And then he also says for K3, we'd like classes to be smaller, so we're gonna give you an extra amount for that purpose. And 9-12, we'd like you to do career technical education, so we're gonna give you an add-on for that purpose. But focusing just on the basics here, this is just an illustration about how his funding formula would work. Illustration of an elementary district with 10 kids. Right, the district's gonna get the $6,400 for each of the kids. And then for those EL, LI students, the ones that are shaded here, the district will get $2,200, 35% of that base rate those students would generate. And then for the couple of EL, LI children that are above 50%, because those are higher concentrations worth of kids, the district gets another $2,200 just on behalf of that higher concentration. So that's the basic idea of how his new formula, replacing all that old stuff, would work. So as a bunch of analysts, what do we think about it? So we do think it's simple and transparent. I could explain it in a relatively few minutes. I couldn't have done that with the old stuff. It is intended to link funding to costs. K-3 is a little bit less expensive, we think, than high school. Students who come with more significant educational challenges, a bit more expensive to educate than others. So it's linked to students. Apart from those two categorical programs I mentioned, nothing would be antiquated. The students you get today, you'd be funded for them, there'd be a uniform rate, and you'd get more money for certain kinds of students. There's been a lot of conversation about, well, is that base rate, is $6,300, $6,400, $7,700 the right rate? And we think they're ballpark. We actually used a different method that came up with a little bit less. We know that there are groups out there using other methods that come out with a bit more, but they're reasonable. The way that he goes about it, we think, is generally fair. The EL and the LI rates, most other states who have these funding formulas have lower rates. Most of the research says that rates should be higher. Again, we think they're in the ballpark. Although folks can make reasonable arguments as to why they should be higher or lower, we don't think that that should derail the whole effort. Have a conversation, you want to adjust them a little bit in one direction or the other, okay, but the basic design of it seems to us still a sound design. The other good benefit we think of it is focused on students and districts and less on the state and the state's priorities and the state's programs. You have to meet the state spending requirements. It takes away those 60 programs by and large and says, districts, you develop an academic achievement plan, a coherent plan for your students. You hear it in a local setting and you monitor it. The county offices have some role in monitoring it to make sure that you're adhering to it. Again, we think that is a shift to allow districts to have a little bit more flexibility or considerably more flexibility to do what they think they have to do within their local context, their local circumstances, the priorities that they have to run a good program. So quickly, we do think there are some things that could be improved. The home to school transportation and the DSEG money, as almost every other categorical money, we would argue folded into the base and equalize over time. Treat it like all the other categorical programs, that there's not a strong analytical reason why we would keep those separate. We think what he's doing with the K-3 and the CTE is just unnecessarily complicated. Things are going to get complicated on the natural through the regulatory and implementation process. Keep the policy simple. If you think the K-3 rate should be higher, raise the base rate. If you think the 9-12 base rate should be higher because you want high schools to do CTE, raise the base rate. As almost all programs that serve disadvantaged students currently have a provision that the funds be used to supplement the funds, so that you can't just say, okay, I got another $1 for the English learner, but I'm just gonna shuffle the books and really spend more on general ed. We think that there should be a requirement that these students are generating funds. The funds should go back to those students in the form of a smaller class or more instructional materials or tutors, instructional aids, pull-out programs. It should be used to the benefit of the students who generate the funding. And on the concentration grant, again, what he's essentially arguing is any district above average should get some extra money. And again, in the name of being simplistic, we said, well, if you're just above average, why don't increase the base rate? If you really think there are districts with extreme differences because they're serving extremely high concentrations of EL and LI students, whether that's 75 or 80 or 90%, they have a different cost structure. Go ahead and address those districts in a special way. Because basic aid and facilities are, I think, a little off topic today, I'm gonna swim right over those and we can loop back if folks have questions later. So just to finish up here in a couple of minutes, we know that the local control funding formula or some variant of it is not gonna solve all of California's problems. We know we have some major problems with how we get money out to schools today. The funding design is poor. We think the funding design and the local control funding formula is a step in the right direction, would improve the situation. But lots of issues will remain. Again, this isn't an excuse not to do something, it's just a recognition that lots of other challenges face California, which might be why it wants to start tackling a few of them so that they don't keep building up. For CalSTRS, the state has really large unfunded liabilities on the range of $3 or $4 billion a year. It would need to start providing if it wanted to pay down these unfunded liabilities over the next several decades. The governor has said he doesn't want to fund school facilities through the GO bond process anymore, and he doesn't want to put a GO bond measure on the ballot in November of 2014. So then how do we fund school facilities? I think there will be some conversation about what the state and school districts do in that area. With the shift to the Common Core, it's raising many new issues with, okay, what does that mean for curriculum frameworks, for instructional materials, for professional development, for assessments, and for school turnaround efforts for the data that we get on students and teachers? And then what the state and county role is in helping districts turn around schools, I think, is a big question for the future. So that's it.